Hi everyone, I'm Colin McFader and I'm joined by Clark Coffey, and this is the Soldiers of Cinema podcast, the Werner Herzog podcast where we talk about all things in his Masterclass and go through those lessons as well as his broader scope of cinema. And today we're going to be talking about Lesson 12, which is camera techniques.
Oh,
and
I'm
it's all about the
excited.
spatial orientation of the audience. Yeah, it's going to be
Can
great.
you believe it? So I just want to say I'm sorry to interrupt, but just a little, I just want to pat ourselves on the back a little bit here that we are on episode 11. I mean, maybe 10 would have been the episode we should have been it's kind of an anniversary, even number, but I just want to say here at episode 11, I'm pretty excited. So
Me too, yeah.
it's good to be
And this
here
is
again with you, Colin.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, but this is a really interesting lesson too.
Oh,
because
it's hugely important. Yeah.
It's hugely important, but it's not. I think it's another one of those lessons where it's like the name of it, camera techniques, might kind of trick you and make you think it's about something else.
Agreed, because you kind of you think of when I think of camera techniques, right? I'm thinking, okay, much more technical than what Herzog talks about in this class. I'm thinking about maybe camera movements. I'm thinking. I mean, yeah, much more technical than what he discusses here. I feel like what he discusses here is actually really so much more about your actors and your set and manipulating those things spatially as opposed to camera techniques, in my opinion, I think.
Yeah, it's not about dolly zooms and all that stuff. There's a bit of that. I mean, there's a bit of stuff about
There's a little bit,
how you can use the camera to really either orient or disorient the audience. But you're right, it's a lot more about, I would say, the geography of scenes and spaces and how you can use the camera to show those things and use your actors in relation to the camera.
And it's hugely important. I mean, I don't know that I'm not asking necessarily that we pick some specific film out to be mean. Maybe we should not do that. But I'm sure all of us, you've seen a film, I've watched films where the spatial orientation just gets jumbled.
Yes,
and you're not quite sure how spatially characters are in relation to each other, and it's really, I mean, it just completely takes you out of the story,
because then you're distracted by
you're totally right, because now you've switched from I'm in the story to now you're like, wait a minute, where is this? Where are they right now? What they were just at the house, and now is this a different what? Huh?
Well, and another thing that's interesting that Herzog mentions almost immediately is the 180-degree rule, which of course is kind of that.
It's one of the most fundamental
thing that's drilled into to anyone that's learning about film.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you want to describe it real briefly?
Sure. Yeah. So
just in case.
Essentially, it would be that if I were, the most simple way to describe it is if I'm having a conversation with Clark and we're facing each other, that if the camera is to my right, shooting Clark over my shoulder or something like that, that you would draw a 180-degree line between me and Clark, and the camera could not cross over that. And so what that does is it makes sure that if say, again, we're getting an over the shoulder of my right shoulder into you, Clark, and then if we were to cut to the same angle from you over your right shoulder into me, it would look like both of us were staring in the same direction.
Your eye line, exactly, our eye lines. If you jump that line, now eye lines look odd, and now the spatial relationship between those two characters, as it's seen by the audience, is totally confusing. You're like,
and I call it the primitive law of filmmaking. Yeah. And that's not meant in a bad way, but it's a simple rule that is kind of necessary to keeping the audience in tune with geography. And I would also say too that there are certainly ways to break it. However, there are very specific. There's almost these list of things that you have to check off if you are going to break it. Okay, do we see the change? Is it clear? Is there a clear body of movement that's moving into the next shot that then continues there, so at least the directional kind of focus of that movement from an actor or something like that. There's very specific things that you can do to break it. But if you break it without doing those things,
it's going to definitely really elicit. Right, it's going to be quite jarring to an audience for sure. And most people, they won't even be able to necessarily say, audiences would not necessarily catch. Wait, eye lines aren't matching. What's going on? I think they just jumped the line. But they're going to say, whoa, this feels weird to me. What's going on? Are they talking to each other anymore? Or are they talking to somebody else?
Are they staring in the same? It turns from a conversation to somebody looking like they're in an audience, discussing, facing one place.
And it's and it's I don't, I'm gonna like go out on a limb here. I don't know that I have the vocabulary to articulate this, like how you would do this perfectly to kind of verbally explain this visual thing. But one of the most difficult things to film is like a scene where you've got 4 or 5 people sitting at a table, eating, talking. Or it's when you've got so many different eye lines, you've got so many different people in this compressed, dense area of space. And everyone is kind of, at the same vertical height. Everybody's sitting down. It can get really challenging.
Well, there's three. I almost kind of describe it as there's three different ways. Of course, there's more than three, but there's three really common ways of dealing with something like that.
Right.
The first one I would say is just locking those characters down and doing the kind of mental work to make sure that you know where everyone's eye lines are and the camera's locked down, and you just, which can be super difficult. Movie that did it really well recently, though, was Knives Out, which has a huge cast of characters.
Good
and all
example.
these scenes where people are sitting in, rooms together.
Yes.
And I can't imagine trying to focus on who's talking to who, when, where, what.
But it's very clear. But I've seen the film, and they do a very good job. Right.
And the second one I would say is Tarantino does it in Reservoir Dogs around the table, where the camera's actually spinning around the table at all times.
Yes.
And it's that momentum that almost keeps it moving, and even if there are, it almost kind of
and it's
hides
wide.
mistakes.
Let just in case it's been a while since people have seen Reservoir Dogs, if it has been a while, you should go back and see it. It's a great film. But yeah, he keeps it very wide. So you're always, whoever's talking to each other, both characters are always in the shot.
Yes.
So that is obviously another way to do it. If you can see both characters, then their spatial orientation is obviously quite clear.
Yeah, and he also, one of the things that he does in that scene, which makes it much easier if you're trying to do this, is that even when the two characters are talking to each other, oftentimes the character who's speaking is speaking to everybody. So they can sort of go back and forth between the characters, and even if you cut to them talking to one character and then suddenly they're talking to another in the next shot, it makes sense because you could just assume, okay, he turned his head.
Right.
The last way that I usually see, or that is kind of commonly seen, is kind of something that Bong Joon-ho does a lot, which is just doing a oneer. And not a moving oneer, but just setting up the characters if they're sitting at a table, sort of almost like Last Supper, where they're all on one side, and the geography in this tableau is very interesting, and they sort of talk like that.
It's kind of Wes Anderson-esque, kind of very theatrical.
Exactly.
Yeah, very theatrical, right?
Which can work really well, and honestly, in terms of establishing geography, is probably the easiest, but it can be very difficult to get a shot like that to look good, and it takes a lot of talent to kind of make it look like it's intentional.
It is very difficult, and it's. I would say look good. That's one thing. It's going to automatically create a style for your film if you're shooting those types of tableau type shots. That's really difficult. I mean, it's going to automatically, put a twist on the style of the film that you may not want or may not be appropriate, But I go back kind of Wes Anderson. You look at all of his films. Now, obviously, there's more than this one component that makes up his style. But those kind of symmetrical tableau, everybody kind of in one shot that he does so much of, is kind of one of the things that first jumps out of my mind. But it's hard to not have that impact your style very significantly if you're shooting that way.
Yeah, exactly. Those are kind of interesting ways of shooting. Like, as you said, these wide, even if it's not necessarily people sitting at a table, as I mentioned in Knives Out, sometimes it's just like people in a living room on couches and chairs and stuff, and they're not necessarily in a circle either. But that's such a key fundamental thing to understand is eye lines, and because it's, there's nothing worse than watching. And it doesn't. I'm not even going to say student film, because a lot of bigger budget movies do this. When you have a group of characters speaking and it just makes no sense, like who's talking to who, where is that person looking, why is that person suddenly talking to that person when in the last shot they were looking at that person, or they were even in a completely different position. It can be really difficult to master.
I mean, and so I think, you and I both agree, and I think, pretty much anybody would agree, yes, this is important. Do you have anything, I can kind of share a little bit about what I've done to kind of work on this for myself, if you might want to share some of what you've done. I think, first and foremost, I think as someone who's a fan of film, I've watched film, since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And I've just steeped in it, visual storytelling. And so you start to pick up things. But of course, this is something you can practice. when you're shooting, and you don't even have to necessarily have a film, or a story that you're shooting. You can get some friends together without a script, and you can start shooting conversations, and you can start practicing this stuff just in the comfort of your own home. I don't know if you've ever done this. I've done it on some complicated shots where with a lot of characters, and especially when I've got some action, where I create an overhead and basically like a schematic or like a blueprint, I guess would be a better. Yeah. And I've actually done that before just to kind of make sure, okay, I've got this kind of, really thoroughly visualized in my head. I understand, where character's going, where I'm going to put the camera. And then I can kind of visualize that, what the edited result is going to end up looking like. And that's helped me a lot on set so I don't get confused. Because even when you've had a lot of experience, which I'm not even saying I've had, I've definitely had moments where I'm on set and I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Whoa. Okay, hold on now. Where do we, how is this going to, how do we need to set up the camera here or set up the characters to not get things confused? But those are some things that I've done. I think there's even apps that are free or near free that make visualizing shots like this very simple for iPads or iOS or something like that. But any suggestions you might have, or ways that you have found have been effective? I think a lot of it is intuitive. But
I was going to say it's a boring answer for me. It's just prepare. I think shot listing and just getting it down. Sometimes not I wouldn't necessarily say that I storyboard very frequently.
Right. Me neither.
But utilizing a type, sort of a proto storyboard for things like this, where, like you said, where maybe it's not necessarily the actual shots to shot on the storyboard.
For me, it's like an overhead.
Yeah,
for me, it's like literally an overhead, and I just have like circles for characters and a triangle for the camera.
Yeah, and
I just simply like the space that I'm in. I mean, it's literally like a blueprint, and I'm just making sure and I can kind of have axes drawn, and I'm kind of like, okay, I've got X number of characters, and here's who's going to be speaking, and here's where they're moving, and but a lot of it is kind of, I think, just doing it over time. You start to get there, but. Hopefully the DP that you're working with is also there to help just make sure, that you're not making any mistakes.
That's what's funny is it seems like these can often be the longest to shoot.
Yeah.
Because not only do you have to work out the spatial orientation of the camera in relation to the actors, you also have to make sure that at every angle there's no lights in the shot, there's no reflections, there's no equipment in the background for some reason. I mean, it was a big challenge with the Hitchcock movie that we just made.
Right.
Was getting both reflections out of windows and being able to light the room without, changing lighting to such a degree when we turn around the camera to the other angle.
Yeah.
And suddenly, you have to figure, okay, that light was there. Now we got to move it over here, but that looks too different from the last shot if that source was coming from there. So it can be a really big headache, and that's why.
Well, you're bringing up a really good point. Let's talk about this a little bit more, because up until this point, we've basically been talking about the spatial orientation of characters. But you're talking, but there's so much more, right? Your motivated lighting, like where's lighting coming from? Keeping that consistent, still maintaining an appropriately lit scene to the aesthetic that you're working to achieve, or just for the sake of competency to have it lit well. As you're turning the camera around and moving things back and forth, to make sure that these other aspects are consistent spatially as well. An audience may not be able to pick out exactly what's up, but if lights start to come from all different areas, and it's like windows seem to disappear and reappear on different sides of things, that's definitely gonna, I think, pull people out of the story.
And I think it's that amateur thing that everybody has done when they start making movies, which is just like, okay, we've got a light over here for this angle, and then the reverse angle, we're just turning the light around.
We'll just turn it,
And it's like, well, where's that light coming?
Where's the light coming?
The best lighting setups are the ones that you have to do very, very little change to if the angle switches, that you light the space like it's
right.
It's authentic and it's real and you're kind of in there.
Right.
And I think that the other thing too, that really helped me with the Hitchcock movie in particular, and is if you have the space available to you in advance, is I did an entire previs of the entire movie. So absolutely every single shot I shot and I lit as it would be in the movie, so that I knew, okay, I'm standing here for this shot, and then it gets a reverse on me. The lighting has to be the same. Say I've got a light hitting the back of my neck because you see me in both shots.
Yeah.
where can I put the light that's not going to be seen in either? Kind of things like that. And then again, because I was doing a previs and I was actually seeing it on camera, I was able to, spend a night literally just moving things around and making sure that it worked. So then the crew got there and I could just be like, okay, this needs to be there. There was none of that kind of like trial and error on the day.
Well, and I will say though too, on the flip side, I mean, we've talked about kind of, spatial orientation, geography, just maintaining consistency such that you're not breaking cinematic grammar and taking people out of the story. But there's also, there's a great opportunity here in the spatial orientation of of everything in your mise en scène, right? That these are great opportunities for storytelling. The position of your characters, relative to each other, there's so much that you can do there to convey more story. This character sitting above or standing above another character, how far characters are from each other. This has, it tells us a huge amount. Is there a big desk between, right? Is there, are there objects between two characters? Are there eye lines occluded? Are they speaking through I mean, there's just so much that you can do with the geography of characters.
And that's a great point to play with the camera as a third character too.
Yeah.
Is to, if the character is supposed to feel cold and kind of sterile, then zoom in on them from a distance. And don't have the camera near them. Whereas if they're supposed to be warm and welcoming, then
there physically
maybe get closer to them and things like that. And the Coen brothers are really great at doing that because so many of their scenes, they're kind of dialogue, shot over shot scenes that are very, very basic scenes when you think about it geographically. But they still, exactly what you said, use those opportunities to tell stories. So because so many of those scenes in the Coen brothers kind of style is to make things very not intimate between two characters, very awkward, very kind of dry humor. Estranged. So what they do is often plop the camera between the characters and then just use wide lenses so it feels like they're further away from the camera that they actually are, which is, I think, quite genius, but very simple.
Well, and it's also, there's great opportunities for suspense. For foreshadowing, great opportunities to kind of set up story or plot points so that you can knock them down or pay them off later on. In our brief conversation prior to recording here, you were talking about a Hitchcock flick specifically. Tell us a little bit about that. The Shadow of a Doubt, which is a 1943 film by Hitchcock. That was a great example, I felt like, where he had kind of established the geography of the house or the setting and use that as it. Well, why don't you just go ahead and kind of reiterate some of what you were talking about earlier? I thought that was a great example.
Well, I'd say it's super important in any genre, but in horror especially, or in thrillers or something that's supposed to, scare an audience, it can be super, super vital to really lay out geography so that you can use that to your advantage to scare people afterwards and things like that. And in Shadow of a Doubt, you've got essentially the movie takes place in a small town, but primarily in a house. And the house has two entrances. It's got a main floor entrance at the front and then a second story entrance at the back, which is up a series of stairs. And what Hitchcock does is very early on in the movie establishes the two entrances to the house, and one as being kind of a safe entrance, that being the front door that the good people come through, and the other being the good people, the bad entrance that the killer comes through, which is her uncle. And that's not a spoiler because it's very much established right at the beginning of the movie.
I'm thinking 1943. You're okay. We didn't have to do spoiler alert. Maybe we'll go back and we'll put it's
only been out for 70 years.
Only out for 70 years.
So what you wind up having is that because we understand the geography of the house so well, that later on you can use sound, or Hitchcock does use sound, to establish when danger is near. Because we know that this staircase is at the back of the house. We know it creaks, and we know the only person that uses it is this killer, who then, there's moments where they're in the house and they're not paying attention, and suddenly you hear this creak. You know exactly where the character's coming in. You know where our characters need to be, so that Hitchcock is able to then put them in different places in the house where you're going, well, why are you going there? Because he's coming in right there. And it's really, it's a great example. This tension.
It's a great example.
And I think that even just like you said, that this spatial orientation, again, just to more on a broad level of like horror movies in general, so often is it about that, how many horror movies take place in houses where the characters are newly moved in or something, and the first scene is them walking around the house and going, oh, this is my room, this is my room, this is my room, and you get this whole idea of like, yep, exactly, poltergeist. The Exorcist is of course you don't see them moving in, but they're in a house that is kind of being rented for the mother's movie acting career. And you like, how many times can you picture that long hallway in a house? And it's like geography can be so important for horror. I mean, as it is for any genre, but it's just a great example of how to use it in genre.
For sure.
How to use it to your example or your advantage.
At the risk of getting way off track, you talk about horror and the importance of spatial orientation. And being clear on it, The Shining is a very interesting film to talk about in
and
regards
disorienting
to,
too.
And so which Hitchcock also talks about. So here this whole time we're kind of talking about the importance of being clear and communicating, that spatial orientation clearly. But there are definitely points in time where it could be beneficial to disorient your audience. In the lesson here, in Herzog's lesson, he uses the example of Lessons of Darkness, where he's filming this just extraordinarily. I mean, it's so horrific and just awesome in the real meaning of that word. The scope of this and what's happening is just, it's surreal. It's like you can't even take this in. And I think, if he were to have tried to capture that more in a journalistic sense, I just can't imagine that it would have had the kind of impact that it had, how he actually did the film in a very surreal way. Yeah. But that disorientation, I think, is so beautiful in that film because what's happening is so disorientating. It's like, it's like I can't even hardly articulate. I mean, to just see the world on fire and these fields of oil just burning in a black
and his description
sky.
of it being shot like it's an alien witness to this stuff.
Right.
It's so... There's no explanation of the events. There's no
there's no story.
There's no historical context. Exactly. It's just this, probably the most bizarre landscape you could think of.
It's an abstraction.
These oil fields just being, burst into flames, but it looks like living hell. It's incredible. Yeah.
So
he uses that to his advantage, most certainly, especially when the camera flips upside down. There's that famous shot where
the fire is shooting down out of the
and then suddenly everything is like it's as he puts it, and very literally, the world is turned completely upside down.
Yeah,
which is a great example of exactly what we're talking about.
Agreed. And so that's an example he uses, but to go back to horror, I mean, in The Shining, where and there's a lot of kind of mythology about this film and a lot of, urban myths and a whole lot of stuff going on. So we don't have to get into too much, but I mean, and I'm not an expert scholar of the film, but I think Kubrick does interesting things with the spatial orientation of hallways and rooms and things, right? That's kind of not quite right and a little bit
the maze is
off,
different in every single shot. I think
that
they changed the layout of the maze in every single scene that it's in,
right?
Which is really neat.
It is, and so there are definitely moments where to shake things up and to if the story calls for some confusion, that could be potentially a great way to illustrate that visually. But
here's an example of that very close to me right now that I can speak to very well, is just the feature that I'm working on right now.
Okay.
Which is, so to put into context the difference between disorienting and orienting an audience, the initial draft of the script that we had done, my main concern was how disorienting it was. There was a lot of running from the backyard to the front yard, up the stairs, down the stairs, all this stuff. And I was like, we need a way to orient the audience to this house because it's not intentional there. Yeah. It's completely unintentional. Just, it was the character needing to go to places and us following, and it felt really disoriented. So we wound up just changing out the whole intro of the movie so that we do learn where everything is and what's going on. And then later on, though, you can use that to disorient an audience by changing things, just like in The Shining, where whether it's, there's nothing in the movie that actually physically changes like to the degree that it does in The Shining, where, hallways change and things like that. But just changing it goes from day to night and it's pitch black inside and you don't know what's going on and things like that, you're intentionally disorienting the audience for a response. Whereas that can be very different from unintentionally disorienting an audience, like in a lot of action movies where you've got the shaky cam and
horrible editing between. Don't get me started on that. This is one of my biggest pet peeves and frustrations with. And you and I were actually kind of discussing Marvel movies for a minute here before we started recording, and it's, sadly, and I guess I get why, especially in television, because it's so much cheaper. It's so much easier to just shoot action, chop it up into tiny little pieces, and have a shaky cam and a bunch of quick edits, and use that to impart the violence
intensity,
and the intensity
and doing
of
intensity
this.
with air quotes,
right? But of course, to actually have long shots and really long wide shots and actually see what's going on requires. I mean, it's just much more difficult to shoot. But yeah, that's a whole other.
And I do actually want to mention in close relation to this, that he's kind of got a bad rap, but he's a very interesting director to study because oftentimes of the things that he likes. But Michael Bay, is a huge West Side Story is Michael Bay's favorite movie.
Okay.
He loves West Side Story, and what's interesting about Michael Bay is that you can actually see the way that he uses the geographic setups in a song like America and West Side Story in his action scenes, and that's honestly. Even though he does kind of have that stereotype about him about shaky cam and kind of quick edits and things like that, I actually rewatched the first Transformers recently.
Okay, I'm surprised.
Weirdly enough, it's quite geographic. Like, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of cuts in these action scenes. There's a lot of shaky cam.
Yeah.
But he does a lot of work to establish where everything is when.
You feel like he keeps it clear, huh?
Which is really interesting.
I can't speak to it myself. I don't think I've actually... Is that the one with Shia LaBeouf?
Yeah, Shia LaBeouf.
Okay.
It's in
I
Megan
may have
Fox.
actually seen it when it first came out, or,
I don't think I'd seen it since it came out. I think
I don't
this
even
is the
know
first time I watched
how
it in
old
years.
is that movie now?
2007, I think it was when it came out.
Wow.
And I saw it in theaters when it came out, and I think that I haven't seen it pretty much since then. But I was expecting going into it a lot of exactly what we're talking about in the negative sense, where it's like things don't make sense. But he actually, and I think I owe it a lot to his love of West Side Story and these Golden Age musicals, where it's like, I mean, when you get down to it, you're essentially filming these things in the same way. One's an action scene and one's a big dance sequence, but they're both massive set pieces with lots of moving parts.
With lots of movement, yeah.
And
that's a good point.
It makes sense that he likes it. Whereas on the other spectrum of this, the Man of Steel movies, those newer Superman,
which I've not seen any of those.
Which I've not seen since they were in theaters. But the final fight in Man of Steel is kind of a historically famous example of like not making any sense. They're just kind of throwing people into buildings and like just dust, and it's
just
dark.
Right, and you just have these cuts that are a quarter of a second long with just a fist and a foot. And I've not seen it, but I've seen similar other examples like this where it's just you don't even know what's going on. I mean, it's clear that they just filmed a bunch of fighting. They took a bunch of takes. They just chopped up a bunch of in this splice like these fractions of a second long. And you've got a lot of inserts and a lot to try to impart the impact of fist and feet and whatever else, and it's just and then of course there are other examples of extraordinary. There's a couple things like what was is it Old Boy, the original one? Is that where there's like some
hallway? Yeah, there's the famous hallway scene,
and I think. Was it Daredevil kind of copied that scene in one of their...
I never watched Daredevil, but I know the scene you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking about.
They always ended the season with like a oneer kind of thing that was inspired by... Well, right. I mean, again, and that's why I kind of wanted to talk about action and horror, because they're two movies that are very easy to kind of point out the technique behind.
Yeah.
But you even look at the difference between something like, let's talk about a very famous movie, Star Wars. The difference between the fight between the Luke and Vader fight in Empire when they're on Cloud City, and that it's very methodical. Every shot is planned out. Everything makes sense. A sweep of movement in one direction matches with the next shot and things like that.
Right.
And then you look at some of the fights from the prequel trilogy, and they're just all over the place. It's very much, it turns into that more kind of Marvel style of filmmaking where, as you said, you're just kind of getting a series of VFX plates and then cutting them all together and just hoping that it mixes. And oftentimes, it may look similar and look congruent, but there's something missing, I think, subconsciously, where you're just kind of going, well, that doesn't really feel like real. It doesn't feel fluid.
And it kind of, honestly, I mean, I think a lot of that translates to boredom, frankly. I think, again, I don't think that the average audience, isn't going to be able to articulate. They're not formulated in their mind. There's like a spatial geography problem here, and these edits are quick, and everything is such a there's such close shots. I can't tell who's who. I mean, it's unlikely they're going to articulate things like this, but I think it just like fundamentally, it just manifests itself, right, as like boredom. They're like, I'm not in this. I'm not in the story. I don't, you know.
And that's the big danger about, just to go back to geography, is that I think that people check out if things don't make sense,
right,
or non-intentionally make sense, because I think that something like The Shining that does it really well and intentionally and is planned out and methodical about it, then that draws an audience in even further.
It's within an infrastructure of understanding. It's it's not that you don't understand everything. It's like you've created, like you've taken the time, you've created an infrastructure of understanding. Your audience knows what's going on, but there's a space. There's a space where there's disorientation.
Yeah. But no, I think that, again, you can have an audience check out at the snap of a finger if you don't really pay attention to this stuff, because you're only going to, film is technically a passive medium. You're not thinking about every single shot as you see it. It's not like reading where you have to read.
Right.
You're being flashed images at your face that your brain makes sense of.
Correct.
And if your brain is now requiring you to actively make work or make sense of what's going on in a negative sense, where you're just kind of like, I'm confused, then you're probably gonna check out of that movie and go, I'm done.
Well, it's a good thing it's a good point that you make. I think, looking at musicals, looking at horror films, and looking at how action are shot. I mean, these films can contain some of the most complicated and extreme examples of maintaining and manipulating the spatial orientation of characters and objects. And so, I think that's great advice. I especially like your idea, that looking at musicals, those often involve a lot of people. And there's some like really interesting things to learn, I think, from watching a lot of musicals.
Totally.
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's interesting too. So, we've talked about, the importance of geography, and then we've talked about kind of ways, when it might be appropriate to disorient your audience by manipulating those things. Herzog mentions a couple other things, kind of smaller, but let's touch on them here. He talks about the Kinski Spiral, which is funny. I think both of us, when we were originally taking this class and we were doing one of the exercises, I think you and I both had a character interframe using this Kinski Spiral.
Yes,
I think it was part of the homework. I don't remember exactly, but I think we had to make a short film, and it was like, okay, you've got to make it,
use
really
the Kinski
quickly
Spiral somewhere
and use it somewhere. Yeah. And it's funny, I don't know that I'd ever consciously recognized this, except to say, I mean, I definitely, we see the example of Kinski in A Gary, and then we see the example of Nicolas Cage in Bad Lieutenant, and I may not have been able to have pointed out, like, there's Kinski Spiral, because I didn't even know there was a name for it.
Yeah.
Right, but I certainly recall, like, the overall impact of what an interesting way to enter frame.
Yes.
And for me, just to kind of expand that past just this one very specific thing, it's a good reminder of how important the physicality is of your actors. And that you and I have talked about this in another episode, where we talked about wanting to direct right there from the camera, being right next to the action, and how it's a dance, it's a physicality. You're in a rhythm, especially when you're operating. You're there in the scene with the actor. I mean, you are absolutely in this scene. It just so happens that you're not on film, but you are definitely in the scene. And I think this really speaks to the importance of physicality, and so working with your actors on that. I think there's another place where Herzog talks about how he worked with Nicolas Cage on the physicality of his, and with the Gary. Interestingly, and they have very similar physicalities. Herzog talks about the uneven shoulders, and
this kind of
Gary has like a misformed arm, and Cage's character has a broken back, and his it's kind of twisted, and his shoulders are uneven and staggered. But just one more example of how important that is. There's so much power can be had. I mean, again, it's a visual medium, right? And I think it's obvious, but I think it's so obvious that it's almost forgotten sometimes. I see so many examples of where people are trying to say everything there is to say about a character through the dialogue.
Yes, exactly.
And
Don't tell.
Forget,
I mean, that's
yeah. And I'm like, just don't forget. There's this whole world that you can explore with how you manipulate, what kind of physicality are you creating for the characters, but in conjunction. I mean, the spiral is a great example of, okay, there's the physicality of the actor, but then how does that dance take place then? What's the tango with the camera and the actor with that physicality together? It's just a great example.
And just to real quickly, just to explain what the Kinski Spiral is.
Of course, just in case. Good point.
It's basically if you had a camera on a tripod, that I, as the actor, would be standing right next to it, like right pressed pretty much right up against the camera, but not on camera. So like right to camera left or something. Or it could be camera right if you were to reverse it. And then I would take pretty much my left leg and step right across, right into frame, and my face would be so close to the camera, and I almost spin as I do it, and then take a few steps
twisting.
Back.
It's almost like a twist, like your body is twisting around into the front of the camera. Yeah,
I'm sure that you can, if you Google the Kinski Spiral, it should come up, but it's a very, very distinct way of entering frame. And I think that it's a great example again of kind of, again, as you said, that bond between camera and camera movement and actors and the space and things like that.
So I've just confirmed. If you Google Kinski Spiral, yes. And
okay,
not
great.
only this,
Excellent.
now this is awesome. Okay, so you got Nick Cage and his performance in Bad Lieutenant. Of course, you've got Kinski's in Aguirre. I have not seen this yet, but apparently Nicole Kidman does this in Queen of the Desert as well.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I am gonna check that out as soon as
this
podcast, as soon as we're done recording this. But I am like, I didn't know that. So okay, so clearly, Herzog really loves this move and is still Queen of the Desert is now a 5-year-old flick, but still in a more recent film he's using it. But I think one of the other like kind of physicalities that he talks about is the Nazarian Walk. And this one was, I'm going to have to admit, it wasn't as immediately obvious to me what he was doing here. I didn't feel like the impact was as pronounced as the Kinski Spiral. The Spiral,
I think I sort of got it on it, weirdly enough.
Okay. I mean, why don't you describe it then? Like, articulate for the people at home what you feel like Herzog is trying to do with the Nazarian Walk and how he's doing it.
Very, very simply, it's a way of almost cutting together I guess montage would be a good word for it, of far distances traveled. And the way that he does it is he positions the actor really close to camera to start, and then almost has the camera spiral up really at a really intense angle, and then follow them off into the distance. And if you keep cutting between these different shots, it just gives the impression that because the actor starts so close to the camera and then ends in the shot so far that they're traveling over distance.
So I missed that. So are you saying that it's like a string of cuts that he's putting a string of these shots together?
I'm not necessarily sure if it has to be a string or not.
Okay.
But if even just having one, just because it's such a visceral difference between being so close and then suddenly at the end you're so I
almost feel like I get a sense of, in my interpretation, or just what I felt. It's not even interpretation, but just what my kind of intuitive reaction to it was that it's almost like the actor, you get a sense that the actor is actually walking from behind the camera. And so that's what gives a sense that this actor has been moving, right? That he didn't, it wasn't just action and he just, or she, of course, just walked in, right there. It gives a sense that that this character has been walking from far behind the camera, comes up over the camera, and then we kind of pick it up.
Yeah,
and
the
we
camera
see the
almost
action
finds
extend.
them. Yeah,
right. I think so. That's okay. Yeah, that's kind of. I appreciate you helping me kind of sort that out. When I first
just a quick side note too,
I was like,
I do love his little names that he gives all these little techniques that he has.
I know. Yeah. It is quite nice. Nice. Well, and speaking, okay, and to finish out the episode, speaking of loving Herzog, the Iguanas. I think it's kind of funny that they put this. I mean, I feel like it's the last third or so of this lesson he's talking about iguanas, and
he spends a long time on it. Yeah.
He spends a long time. Now, of course, Herzog, animals play a vital role in so many of his films. It's a big part of his storytelling kind of repertoire, especially chickens, which I think we may talk about in another lesson. I'm not sure, but he uses an example here. So going back to Bad Lieutenant, he's talking about Nick Cage is this like drugged out dude, police officer, and there's an iguana in a room, and I think Herzog is using like this small little kind of pinhole camera. I'm not sure exactly what exact camera he's using.
It's almost like a probe camera of some sort.
So,
like
yeah,
it's like
tiny little, like super wide angle, but very small, I think. Anyway, and it's kind of like the iguana's POV almost, right? And it's kind of, he's utilizing this to show us the kind of put us inside the mind of Nick Cage, that he's the surrealness and the kind of, disorientation and, this addled kind of place that Nick is in, or his character is in, rather. But it's pretty hysterical. Herzog talks about the iguana biting him, and the iguana bit his hand or something, I guess, and he could barely pry the jaws of this iguana off his hand. I don't know. It just illustrates once more. Look, like not everything has to be anything more than just a good story, and I almost feel like this last part is just a good story from Herzog.
Yeah, and it's the shot is very interesting looking for sure, but I almost find that the more interesting aspect of this part is the story. Yeah,
exactly. For sure. It's a good story,
and it's almost like his dedication to telling the story that's so great.
There's no question. I mean, and I think, not to, again, we can wrap this up here in a few minutes, but just to sidestep here for just a second. I mean, as an aspiring director or filmmaker out there, for everybody, you are, Cullen. I'm assuming many people in the audience are aspiring filmmakers. If you're interested in the Masterclass lesson, you've probably been trying to pick up some pointers, right? I think it's such an important lesson to learn here. You see Herzog, you see how, and this is all within an absolute, like, he is absolutely authentic. It's him. So this is not some fake kind of marketing thing, but he has created such an extraordinary character that is him. You speak to the devotion with which he, or the dedication with which he tells the story, and I think almost every story. I mean, it's these things are very important to him. And I think he does a good job of, honestly, like, not taking himself too seriously, but he takes what he does, of course, like, clearly very seriously.
Yeah.
But I just love, it's that intensity, it's that dedication, it's that, he pulls you on board when he's telling stories. He's so clearly just, a good storyteller. But it's kind of good just, to have an example, to kind of watch him talk about his stories. That's something that directors have to do. You have to talk about your stories to your fellow cast and crew. You have to share your vision with them. Hopefully you get to a place where you're having to share your vision with press. And whether this is at, just speaking at a Q&A at a small festival, or you're being interviewed for, Variety. I mean, it's a big part of what you'll have to do as a successful filmmaker, and you could do a lot worse than watching him and learning from him.
Yeah, totally.
So, all right. Well, I think unless you've got anything else to add.
No, I'm done. I'm good.
You're done. Yeah. I'm like, man, I'm out of here. I'm gonna go shoot something.
Yeah, see ya.
Well, you do have a few projects.
I
both
do.
So so this is good. This is exciting, and maybe in a future episode we can share a little bit more about some of these exciting things that are happening with our own projects. But until then, Cullen, as always, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And everybody listening out there, we appreciate it. We hope that it's entertaining, informative, and heck, even if you're just laughing at us, as long as you laugh, that's all we care about.
Exactly.
All right. So until next week, where we will be discussing what's next week. It's lesson 13, Lucky 13, working with actors. Ooh, I'm really excited about this one.
Yeah.
This is probably because I've spent so much time as an actor on the other side. I'm really excited about this one. I'll look forward to it. All right. Well, until then, everybody, take care. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.